My name is Lance Peterman. As was mentioned, I work for Merck. Just briefly, kind of my introduction safe harbor slide. I've been in IAM for about 22 years now. Of course, back then they didn't call it IAM. Currently, I work in identity access management, wearing a number of different hats for Merck and company. I'm also a volunteer high school speech and debate coach. I don't make any warranties or guarantees as to my performance based on that fact. My opinions are also my own, which is obviously the primary purpose of this slide. I will make these slides available on SlideShare. I think CIS is doing that as well, and I'll publish that link on Twitter if you're interested. So in case it isn't obvious from the two pictures, I have two main passions in life. One obviously is digital identity, but the other more obviously is my horses. And it's pretty rare that those two worlds collide, but as it happened about a month ago, I had what I would like to call a self-inflicted teachable moment. And my wife and I have a small horse farm in Charlotte, North Carolina. This is not it. I wish it were. This was actually at a plantation that we visited in Charleston. And within that small farm, we occasionally let our horses out to graze on the grass on our smallish pastures. In order to get access to those pastures, our horses have to pass through a series of gates, much like your average enterprise. In order for them to do that, we have to lead them through there and make sure that those gates stay locked in order to prevent the horses from getting places where they shouldn't. Well, as luck would have it, one day, I apparently did not cleanly lock one of the gates, and the little pony there, you see, who looks like the harmless one, right, managed to get out. And as with most breaches, I was not the person to discover this. My neighbors were, which followed by a call to my wife, which then followed by a call to me. And let me tell you, that is not a conversation I wish for anyone to have. The good news was, Pony didn't get far. She found the next patch of grass she could find. We got her back in. And yes, her name is actually Pony. Although I have nicknamed her Dropbox now because DLP was kind of awkward. So what does this have to do with identity and access management? I'll connect the dots a little bit, but hopefully it's a little obvious. Identity and access management programs are only as good as the people, processes, and technologies that surround them. Any one of those can fail, and you can result in a breach, or in this case, an escaped horse. And in the realm of privileged account management, as Venkat's already called out, those are the accounts and the identities that hold the proverbial keys to the kingdom. Although I would encourage you to use that analogy a little bit more holistically, especially given the light of where our data is going today. As Venkat already mentioned, the enterprise is changing, and I'll talk to that in just a second. So my hope in this session is to unpack some of the complexity behind privileged access management. And we'll do that by starting out with a brief definition of what privileged access management is, because it can cover a broad spectrum of activities. We'll talk through why PAM's necessary by looking very briefly at a couple of breaches, but we're going to put it in the lens of privileged access and elevated access compromise. And then we'll take a look at PAM as a program. And we'll talk through what some of the practices are, some keynotes with respect to that. We'll look through some of the average use cases with respect to privileged access management. We'll look through some keys to success, and then finally some of the challenges that I've had as I implemented a PAM program at Merck, and some of the war stories that I've been able to share with colleagues that have experienced through their own programs. So what is PAM? Well, this is what it's not. I was going to put a picture of Pam Dingle up here, but I thought this was more fitting. To understand privileged access management, you need to first understand what privileged access is. And as the slide says, basically it's any feature of a system that gives you the ability to override basic controls. So that, in the conventional context, is your administrator, your root, that type of access. Privileged accounts or identities are simply those identities that hold those permissions. And then finally, the use of privileged accounts should be managed and the password monitored when it's stored digitally. You should be able to log and audit those privileged uses and make it traceable to a unique user. If you have 15 different users sharing the same root account, you need to have a mechanism in order to know who made those changes. That is, in essence, a privileged access management program. So as Venkat alluded to, our world has changed. The idea of, and this didn't come out quite as nice as I thought it would, the idea of the traditional perimeter defense has kind of gone by the wayside. I claim the perimeter's gone. It's not that identity is the new perimeter. I know that's a very nice saying, and to be honest, I embraced it for a long time. My contention now is the perimeter's gone. So now you're looking at all of the access and security controls working in concert. So you wind up with a world like this where your data's going everywhere on any device, on any platform, in any location. The good news is identity is still a top security control that can help you determine what you're authorized to do regardless of your location. So now we'll talk through a couple of breaches. And some of these aren't super recent, but they're very instructive from a privileged access perspective. And this one hits home because this is just south of where I live in the state of South Carolina. And a compromise of a privileged account resulted in every single taxpayer, whether it's a business or an individual, having their identity breached. They exfiltrated several gigabytes of data that contained the records of every taxpayer in South Carolina. Now, was this a super user root account? No. As it turned out, it was a backup account. So again, when I talk about changing that perspective of what you consider to be a privileged identity, take a look at accounts of that nature, because they were able to exfiltrate a backup of their taxpayer database without them being aware, because the other security controls weren't in place, like an intrusion detection, intrusion prevention system. And of course, the good taxpayers of South Carolina were compensated for this with 1 year of free credit monitoring. I've heard that they're considering renewing this, but needless to say, they need to do a little bit more than that. In the case of Saudi Aramco, this was an interesting attack, and I'm not going to ask people to raise their hands because they're going to go, "Hi, I'm a target." But basically what happened was, in every PC within that organization, they all had the exact local admin password on their Windows workstation. This is a very common practice. Why? It makes it easy for your administrators to execute command functions. Well, what an insider did was take advantage of that, and using that credential, they executed an attack that wiped out 30,000 hard drives in that organization. The good news was they backed up those hard drives, so they were able to recover a lot of the data, but to say that this was highly disruptive would be an understatement. Basically, take a look at your local admin practices, and I would also encourage varying that password. eBay I'll talk to briefly. Basically, this was your classic phishing attack that Venkat's already talked through. But one of the things that it identified was, and this is a key practice that needs to end, if the account that you're using to send emails and write Word documents and write PowerPoint presentations like this has root level access to any of your critical systems, that needs to change. The root account should be separate from your primary credential. And then finally, this is my little jab at eBay. They don't have two-factor authentication for their regular user eBay accounts, with one minor exception, but it requires that you buy a second factor of authentication, and I think that should change. This is just a very brief note about default passwords. Some Canadian teenagers accessed a very old ATM user manual and found and managed to find an ATM that still had the default password on it. Guess what kind of mischief they could get into? So always make sure you change your default passwords when you bring in a new application or system into your organization. So what does that tell us? Obviously, the threat landscape is changing daily. Venkat's already touched on that. The elevation of access, or the compromised of privileged access, is the key stage in all attacks, according to the Cyber Sheath report. As has already been mentioned with the Verizon DBIR, the key here is most of these are preventable with basic controls. And in a 2012 survey, only 43% of respondents said either that they did not have a PAM practice or wasn't sure if they did. And if you're not sure if you have one, you probably don't. So what does the practice of privileged access management look like? Well, obviously it's designed to answer who has access, when it was used, where it was used from, and what was done. And the fifth one I would add in there is who approved that access. One key thing I want to stress is that technology is only one part of this equation. The people and the processes that execute these are critical to ensuring that you're getting beyond compliance and you're actually secure. And the other piece is this has to be part of your governance process. A lot of perspective, and I'll share this a little bit with the challenges, is there's this mentality of, okay, I've got my accounts enrolled, I'm done. And that's not it. This has to be part of your SDLC process or whatever process that you're using so that compliance is a life cycle. It's not just a one-time event. I also want to talk about collaboration. This is not a project that your identity and access management team enables on its own. This is a highly collaborative effort that you do with your business to identify where your risks are, identify your requirements for those processes if they don't exist, or revise the processes where appropriate. You want to make PAM part of your security DNA. Encourage your stakeholders to ask questions about privileged access when they're reviewing applications and risks, because you're not going to be in the room every time they're looking at a vendor to buy a product. And finally, educate your business owners when you can. The more they understand and know about privileged access management, the more secure you're going to be long term. Now we'll talk through a couple of use cases on privileged access management. And these are the two big ones. And the first one is password vaulting or privileged password management. And the second one is session management. Vaulting is just like it sounds. It's similar to if you own a LastPass account, very similar concept. You store these passwords that you make them as big and as complex as possible, and when practicable, you don't even know what they are, because those are, of course, the most secure passwords, right? And then you check that password out, you go to your system, you do your job. When you're done doing your job, you check that password back in, or you can time check it out, give them 10 minutes with the password, and then they're done, and then you change that password so that once that session's complete, they don't know what the password is. And then the more secure method is the session management, where they truly don't have any understanding of what the password is. They're initiating an RDP session, a PuTTY session, an XTerm session, whatever it takes to get access to that application, or a web session, whatever it takes to get access to that system, but the system is communicating the password on their behalf. It's a lot more secure. It's not completely secure, because obviously that channel still has to communicate it, and there's opportunities there. Those are the two big patterned use cases, but the smaller ones that kind of couple within that, you obviously have a lot of scripts probably running within your organization where the passwords are sitting there in plain text. That's okay if you have periodic changes included in that process. The challenge with that is getting that into those scripts is a challenge, so you need to find tooling that can help you manage that process, or processes that allow you to do that on a regular basis. I've already talked about local workstation admin management. Getting into the cloud and SaaS accounts, that's one of the key challenge areas for us. There are some vendors out there that specialize in this, but this is kind of nascent territory in terms of managing those privileged identities. And a real quick story on that front, I know that there was a software developer out there that all of their infrastructure was on Amazon, and someone compromised their root Amazon account and managed to delete all of their instances. And they looked at what the cost would be of restoring all of those instances and restoring that data, and the cost was more than it was for the cost of doing business, so they simply shut their doors. That's obviously, a somewhat hyperbolic tale, but that's what can happen out there with the use of these privileged identities. The other thing I would encourage is take a look at all of your hardware platforms, including your industrial systems. If any of you were fortunate enough to catch Dan Hedrick's talk from GE, the safety issues that you can get around with some of your industrial control systems, PAM is at the core of this layer as well and needs to be part of that program. The adoption approach I'm going to go through kind of briefly because it's going to vary by organization, but this was the approach that we took at Merck. We started as a pre-engagement process. So what we did was we did some big briefings where we invited everybody into a room and we said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to give you the tools to start this process, and then we're going to go away. And it was basically to allow them to inventory their systems, let them kind of do it on their own initially, document their access processes if they had any. A lot of them don't. Compile a list of candidate systems, and then begin to prioritize those systems based on risk. Regulatory constraints may drive that. The type of data that is accessible will drive that as well. And finally, we'll start partnering with them to create and revise their access processes. Now, when we come knocking, we can have a more productive conversation because they're ready to roll. So we review that inventory and those target systems. We set up a schedule for deployment. We go through a test environment because one of the things that will make these guys as nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs is all of a sudden, I now have the chance of breaking my system. Because if that account changes and I'm not aware of it, you've now broken my system. And in a company like Merck, if I'm breaking the ability to manufacture vaccines, that's not a pleasant conversation. So you definitely want to test and make sure that those systems are doing what they're supposed to do, make sure that the password changes are occurring in a fashion that aren't breaking other processes. All of those pieces need to take place. And that's where the process criticality comes in. And then finally, once you've done all that, you're ready to deploy into production. So what are some keys to success for this? The first one, obviously, is fault tolerance. The first question you're going to get asked when you implement a PAM program is, where is my pane of glass to break in case of emergency? The short answer, hopefully, is you're not going to have one, because you're going to design a system that is highly fault tolerant. It is geographically dispersed, if that's a need for your company, and it's designed for performance, especially when you're taking geography into consideration. The other thing I will say is adoption of this must have senior leadership support, and it should be driven by policy. I can't stress this enough, because this is one of those rare PAM program or identity programs where the ROI is obvious in terms of preventing breaches, but when you're going to your DBAs, your Unix administrators, your Windows administrators, your application administrators, and you're saying, I'm going to make your life a little bit harder, you're going to get resistance. You're going to be working with the stick more than you're going to be working with the carrot. And so you have to have that backing from leadership that says, this is a priority, get it done. And then you try and have the friendlier conversations. Now, your goal is to try and make this as easy as possible, and that's where you can make some exceptions with respect to policy, but you have to manage it according to risk. As I've said previously, it's a process-first approach. Focus on the tooling second. Consider integration with your configuration management database. That can be a rich source of information. Now, some people will say, my CMDB is not very good and it's out of date. That can be a problem, so maybe that doesn't work. But it can be a resource for you if it's available. Be creative with this. One size does not fit all with these solutions. So take that into account when you're looking at the tooling to go with this. When you're selecting a vendor, consider cloud implications. How are they going to be able to manage an Amazon account or a Salesforce account, things of that nature. Even consider your social media accounts. Some of those are some of the biggest privileged access management challenges out there, because the ability to compromise your company's Twitter account and say really bad things can damage your brand. Definitely eat your own dog food first. You all have identity systems at your enterprise. Implement those with that first. Get a sense of what the user experience is going to be like, because you can share that with those people when you start working for this. And finally, don't think you're too small for this. Every company should be managing their privileged identities. How you do that may vary. You may not have the money or the budget for a giant product to implement into your enterprise. You may not even need it. But the ability to implement controls, even if they're manual, I know manual gets treated as a four-letter word around here, but manual sometimes is necessary, especially for your smaller enterprises. If you can invest in the tooling, that's great. If you can't, still put the processes in place, because you're still protecting your company no matter how big they are. So what were some of the key challenges that we had? As I've already mentioned, clashing with these individual teams has occurred on a regular basis, and that's inevitable. Your product doesn't support the tool that I like to use to manage my databases, or you have Xterm, you don't support PuTTY. All of those are out there, and those are conversations. They shouldn't be, well, just do it. They need to be conversations so that you're trying to come up with the best outcome for them. But it's the classic conflict between security and convenience. Pay particular attention to out-of-band accounts. If a AD domain administrator checks out that credential, he now has the ability to create other AD administrator accounts. So this is where I get back to the idea that compliance is not a one-off event. You need to monitor to make sure that those accounts don't get created out of band. That's where auto-discovery can be an asset for you, and most of the PAM vendors out there, I believe, have auto-discovery. You can target your AD environment. If an AD administrator account gets created, you flag it, or using analytics products, you can detect that as well. Priority is key. A lot of these guys are going to look at you in the face, or women, and say, I got a day job. Onboarding this is hard, and it's not my priority. That's where senior leadership comes in. They can make it part of your KPIs. Really, it should be intrinsic to your operational processes. But if you make it a KPI, then it's something they get measured on at year end. Cloud obviously messes all of this up, except where it doesn't. And as I said, it's got challenges, but there's good news. Vendors are moving into this space. It's a relatively nascent market, but I think there's some maturity taking place there. And finally, with respect to APIs, this is an interesting conversation that would probably occupy a talk unto itself. When you're accessing an API, how do you determine that it's a privileged level access as opposed to a rudimentary, hey, I just need a question answered access? Understanding that is obviously a developing aspect. I think UMA is going to have some interesting play in that space. And then finally, with respect to the role of analytics, I think that's kind of the next generation for integration with your privileged identity management program, is when you're able to detect events where a privileged identity is compromised, you could do some interesting things with it. One of them would be to disable it, but the other one might be, just throwing this out there, delete the account and create a new account. Now, obviously, you have to have mature enough applications and processes that wouldn't be disrupted by that. But that's another great way of making your defense a little bit more agile to those types of processes. So I think that's where analytics is going to be an interesting asset in your privileged access management program. Any questions? This gentleman over here. Sure.
Is that pretty common practice? All those have different password policies, and then someone protects you from hitting your personal account?
The good news is you guys are further along the line from a maturity standpoint, because that's absolutely what I would recommend. Keep the domain admin separate. If it needs to be a discrete account assigned directly to you, that's one thing. It could even be a shared account, provided that the user who's using it is checking it out of your privileged access management tool set, and they can log that session. So you could go either way with that, but you guys are clearly online with that. Yes, sir?
When you define privileged access, do you identify that when you guys do you identify that as the access, the entitlement, or do you define privileged access as the account that has that entitlement?
That's a great question. And I'm going to say the answer is somewhat both. And I also would encourage people to look at privileged access not just at the account level, but look at it through the entire layers of the OSI model, because the conventional one is, okay, what account has root access? And then you might assign that entitlement to a user. But then you can crawl up the application layer, and then your Salesforce account has the application root layer access, and you can assign that entitlement. So you can do it either way. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Lance, for the cloud applications or the web applications not hosted by you, what's the general design pattern?
It depends on your tooling available to you. There are some vendors in that space that, to give you a more rudimentary example, for example, Dashlane, which obviously I wouldn't classify as a PAM vendor, but as a password manager now has the ability, using APIs, to periodically change your passwords on your behalf. And these are with cloud-based services. So I would encourage you to look at vendors that embrace that model. Some of them aren't in that yet. With that said, the default pattern would be more of a vaulting pattern, where you check the credential out, and then you might have to do a manual change to the password, which is not optimal, but you're at least getting that locus of control where the credential is managed, as opposed to relying on somebody remembering what the password is. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for sharing your journey to more secure environment.
My pleasure.
So there's two things that showed up on the market. One called just-in-time administration and one just-enough administration. Have you guys looked into that?
I can't say that we have. Yes, sir.
When you mentioned governance attestation on administrative access, do you find more value in having attestation built into the phone device, or do you see that more being a process of integrating with an IDM?
I think the integration would be ideal. I don't see a lot of vendors that do that. and I don't pretend to know the entire landscape of that. What we do at Merck is the certification process is out of band. That is not to say, like with respect to the approval process, you can tie certain privileged accounts to say, even to check it out, you have to get approval. So you can have a locus of control on that, but for the certification process, for us, we do that out of band with a different product. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.